Hey, amazing viewers, I love connecting with you all around the world. Stay with me until the end, because what I'm about to share will leave you inspired and ready to take control of your own life. In today's story, you'll hear about an incredible twist that no one saw coming. Also, if this is your first time here, press the subscribe button and join our incredible journey. The moment the courtroom doors swung open, a hush fell over the room. You could feel it in the air. Something was about to unfold that would shake the very foundation of justice. Officer Mark Reynolds walked in, every step deliberate, his uniform pristine, his badge gleaming. He exuded an arrogance that filled the room. He was used to walking into places like this with nothing but the authority of his badge to protect him, convinced that no one, not even the law, could touch him. But today, the story was going to be different. Today, it wasn't just any courtroom, and it wasn't just any judge. Today, the world was going to see what happens when someone refuses to let the weight of a badge overshadow the law. Judge Imani Thompson took her seat, her eyes scanning the room. Her presence was magnetic, calm, composed, yet unyielding. She had seen it all. From petty criminals to high-profile cases, she presided over it all. But this trial was different. It wasn't just another case of excessive force. It was a battle for something far greater: the integrity of the law and the accountability of those who swore to uphold it. Reynolds was no stranger to the court. He'd faced accusations before, many times over the years, but somehow, he always walked away unscathed. His colleagues covered for him, his reputation was protected, and the system had always bent in his favor. But this time, things weren't going to go as planned. There was something about Judge Thompson that unsettled him, a no-nonsense approach that made even the most seasoned officers uneasy. She wasn't intimidated by a badge or by power, and she wasn't about to let him walk free. As the case began, the tension in the room was palpable. The prosecution, led by the determined young attorney Danielle Pierce, began to lay out the case. Officer Reynolds, they argued, had used excessive force against Elijah Carter, an unarmed young man, and nearly killed him during a routine stop. But Reynolds didn't look concerned. He sat back, arms folded, his eyes fixed on Judge Thompson as if daring her to challenge him. He was sure of one thing: he had gotten away with this before, and he would again. But Judge Thompson wasn't like the others. Her eyes, sharp as daggers, never wavered. She didn't flinch at his arrogance, nor did she give in to the subtle intimidation tactics that Reynolds was so used to. She knew exactly what kind of man he was. Men like him who hid behind their badge, thinking they were untouchable. But not today. Not in her courtroom. As the evidence started to unfold, witness testimonies, video footage, and medical reports that left no room for doubt, Reynolds still sat there, smug and defiant. He knew the drill: deny everything, question the witnesses, and wait for the jury to lose faith. But this time, there was a twist he hadn't anticipated. The weight of the evidence against him was too much, and for the first time, he began to feel the walls closing in. The courtroom had seen arrogance before, but there was something about Reynolds' demeanor that felt different. It wasn't just confidence. It was a sense of entitlement, as though he was above it all. He smiled, but it wasn't a smile of reassurance. It was a smile that said, "I can't be touched." He thought the law would protect him. But Judge Thompson was about to show him just how wrong he was. The first blow to his confidence came when Judge Thompson addressed him directly. "Officer Reynolds," she said, her voice calm but firm, "do you understand the charges against you?" The room fell silent, waiting for his response. He stood, eyes narrowed, and in a tone dripping with arrogance, he replied, "Yes, Judge, I understand just fine." That moment was a turning point. The power had shifted. Judge Thompson wasn't just another judge. She was a force to be reckoned with, and she was ready to bring Reynolds down, no matter how long it took. The tension in the courtroom was almost unbearable, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. No one knew exactly what would happen next, but everyone knew one thing for sure: Today's trial was going to be different. Judge Imani Thompson sat unwaveringly behind her bench, every inch of her posture exuding authority, while Officer Mark Reynolds, who had grown accustomed to bending the law to his will, began to realize that this time he was in for a fight. Reynolds had seen it all before, cases just like this. Defendants coming in, making a fuss, telling their stories, only to have the system, the courts, the very people who should stand up for justice, protect him in the end. He wasn't worried. After all, he had decades of service behind him. His badge had been a shield that deflected every accusation, every charge. What was one more case? One more unarmed person, one more injury that could be brushed aside with a little clever wording from his lawyer. But as the day unfolded, he felt something shift, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. Danielle Pierce, the prosecutor, was relentless. Every piece of evidence she presented, every witness she called, every report she submitted was airtight. She didn't let up. And yet Reynolds still sat there, his arms folded, a smirk dancing on his lips, as though mocking the very idea that someone might hold him accountable. Judge Thompson, however, was a different story. She wasn't here for games, and she wasn't here for empty words. She was here for one reason: justice. And she wasn't about to let Reynolds or anyone else get away with something just because they wore a uniform. The moment she addressed him directly, there was no mistaking the gravity of the situation. She wasn't interested in hearing excuses. She wasn't going to allow his arrogance to overshadow the truth. The courtroom gasped when the first witness took the stand. Elijah Carter, the victim. His body was still marked with bruises, his arm in a cast, the physical evidence of what had transpired during that night's arrest. Elijah, barely 21, didn't hold back as he recounted the harrowing events of his encounter with Officer Reynolds. The fear in his voice was raw, genuine. His hands trembled as he spoke, but he didn't look away from Reynolds. He couldn't. He wasn't about to let this man hide behind his badge anymore. "I didn't run. I didn't resist. I was just walking home," Elijah explained, his voice breaking. "And yet, when Officer Reynolds pulled up, he slammed me to the ground. He hit me over and over, even when I stopped moving, even when I begged him to stop." The room fell into a stunned silence. People exchanged glances, unsure of how to react. It wasn't just Elijah's testimony. It was the overwhelming weight of the truth behind his words. The evidence, the video footage, the physical injuries. Everything pointed to one undeniable fact. Officer Reynolds had crossed a line, and there was no way to hide from it anymore. Reynolds didn't flinch. He didn't even look at Elijah as he spoke. Instead, he sat back in his chair, his face a mask of indifference. But there was something different in his eyes now. The bravado, the cockiness that had once radiated from him had started to crack. His gaze flickered towards Judge Thompson, who had been watching him the entire time, her eyes never leaving his. And for the first time, Reynolds felt uneasy. For the first time, he wasn't the one in control. As the courtroom waited for the next part of the trial, Judge Thompson looked at the defense. She could see it in Reynolds, his growing unease. He knew what was coming. He knew the pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, and his once unshakable confidence was slipping away. But what Reynolds didn't know was that this was only the beginning. Today wasn't just about proving a point. Today was about something much bigger, the promise of true justice. Judge Thompson's voice rang out through the silence, and it was clear. "Let's proceed." Her words were simple, but they carried the weight of everything she'd worked for. No badge, no title, no power could shield someone from the law. Not in her courtroom. Not today. The powerful ending. The courtroom was now on the edge of its seat, every eye locked onto the unfolding drama. As the trial continued, it became more and more clear. This wasn't just about one man's actions. It was about the entire system. Judge Imani Thompson knew it, and Officer Mark Reynolds was starting to realize it too. No longer was this just another day at work. This was a moment that could change everything. Reynolds tried to hold on to his facade of confidence, but even he couldn't ignore the mounting evidence. The video footage was damning. The witnesses were unwavering in their testimony, and as the defense scrambled to cover for him, Reynolds began to see the cracks in his invulnerability. There was no escaping the truth anymore. The law was a living, breathing thing, and today it was breathing down his neck. He shifted in his seat, still pretending that none of this mattered. But the look in Judge Thompson's eyes told a different story. She wasn't just judging him as a man. She was holding up a mirror to the very soul of the system he represented. Every word she spoke, every glance she cast his way, was a reminder that she wasn't going to let him, nor anyone else, abuse their power without facing the consequences. And then it happened. In a moment that seemed to freeze time, Judge Thompson leaned forward, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "Officer Reynolds," she began, her words firm, her gaze unyielding. "I need you to understand something. You are not above the law. Your badge does not shield you from accountability. No one, not even you, can escape the consequences of their actions." The courtroom held its breath. The silence was deafening. Mark Reynolds, once the embodiment of arrogance, now found himself trembling, not with fear of losing the case, but with the realization that his world was crumbling around him. The very thing he thought protected him was now turning against him. In that moment, Judge Thompson wasn't just a judge. She was the embodiment of justice itself. Reynolds opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. He couldn't form the words. For the first time in his career, he was faced with a woman who refused to be intimidated, who refused to bow to the system he had manipulated for years. And in that silence, something incredible happened. The rest of the courtroom began to stir. The weight of Judge Thompson's words hung heavy in the air, and for the first time, it felt like the scales of justice might actually be balancing. It was then that Judge Thompson turned her gaze to the jury, and her voice echoed with a power that could not be ignored. Today, we stand not just as individuals, but as a society that believes in the rule of law. We stand as a reminder that no matter who you are, no matter what title you carry, the law will always prevail. It will hold you accountable. It will ensure that justice is served. The impact of her words was undeniable. The room seemed to exhale a collective breath, and for the first time in a long while, hope flickered in the hearts of those watching. This wasn't just about this case or about Mark Reynolds. This was about something bigger. It was about making sure that justice wasn't just a word. It was a force that could never be compromised. As the verdict was read, the courtroom erupted. Officer Reynolds, once untouchable, had been found guilty. The moment was a victory, not just for Elijah Carter, but for every person who had ever been wronged by the system. It was a message to the world that no one, not even those in power, were immune from justice. Judge Thompson stood, her head held high, and she looked around the courtroom with a steady gaze. "Remember this," she said, her voice calm but filled with unshakable conviction. "No one is above the law. Not today. Not tomorrow. Not ever." And with those words, she left the courtroom, knowing that her fight had just begun. Because justice, true justice, was a fire that could never be extinguished.